All right, so our next group is going to be talking about an idea that we do a lot with in the normal public relations side of corporate social responsibility and corporate ability. But what they're trying to do is to make those connections with regard to military ability and military CSR, which would be like HADR. So I'm going to hand this over and welcome them.
Good afternoon. I'm Lieutenant Cassie Collins, and I'm here with Lieutenant Ada Willis, Lieutenant Mac Jameson, and Captain Pedro Caballero. Our study, Military CSR in the Eye of the Beholder, examines civilian public perception of the military, specifically looking at millennials of Generation Z, to determine the perceived legitimacy of military action among the next generation of American taxpayers. So, what inspired our topic? According to Pew Research Center, younger generations of Americans are reportedly more socially conscious, but they're less impressed with the military than previous generations. This passive view of the military could have implications for future military funding, domestic support of military action, and overall service member recruitment. So we looked at Signature and Coombs, 1992, and we saw that they stated that national power, that public diplomacy is a key instrument of national power, and it's one that's exercised by the military. So looking at that and recognizing that, we wanted to examine it further. And in examining this further, we looked at 9 2008's bi-dimensional concepts of national power, hard power and soft power, examining corporate social responsibility as it relates to soft power and corporate ability as it relates to hard power. Drawing inspiration from Tao and Wilson's 2016 study on corporate communication, we looked at corporate social responsibility, corporate ability, and a hybrid of these contexts, and placed it within the framework of public perception of military action.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Captain Pedro Caballero, and taking these concepts into consideration, we developed 3 research questions that serve as the basis for each part of our study. In part 1, we operationalized NI's definition of power in foreign policy, hard and soft power, and then we connected those to corporate association terminology. So corporate social responsibility and then corporate ability. And then with that, we created a focal concept of military associations, military ability and military social responsibility. In part 2, we validated these operationalized concepts. And we also asked, how does this connect to PR? How does this connect to military public affairs? So we introduced visual imagery stimuli, and these stimuli were reflective of hard and soft power missions in the military. So HADR, territorial support, staff planning, and then ballistic missile defense. And then we sought to understand, how does this affect the public's perception of the military? And then for part 3, we worked upon that predictive power. And then we utilized the visual imagery from part 2, and then we added a textual emphasis on top of that. And we used social media as a mock vehicle, specifically Twitter, and we mixed the visual and the textual, and we asked again, how does this affect the public's perception of the military?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lieutenant Mac Jameson. So from here on out, we're going to be talking about methodology and findings from our studies. And so for the first part, we had looked at corporate social responsibility and corporate ability, and we created the focal concept of military social responsibility and military ability, but we had to test and see if those actually fit. And so what we did with that is we created 2 statements based on NI's definitions of hard and soft power. So we created 2 statements, then we presented those to our subjects, and then we had to fill out a scale for corporate social responsibility and a scale for corporate ability. Then we looked at the measures of those, and what we found was that they did perceive military ability as ability. They perceived corporate social responsibility as soft power. They were able to tell the difference between those. So from there, we were able to then take that into our second stage of our study. And so for that study, we wanted to see where the boundary was between military social responsibility and military ability. And so we chose to do that with mission visuals. And to do that, we presented 4 separate images, territorial support image, a HADR image, a staff support image, and then a ballistic missile defense image. And what we found from that is that the ballistic missile defense was clearly military ability. People were able to tell that from the imagery. For the other three, it was much more on a continuum between military ability and military and social responsibility. And so for us, that was interesting and an area for future research to look into is what is going into that continuum. How are they really perceiving those? But that was a good starting place, and it led into our part 3 of our study.
So for part 3, we looked at Talon Wilson 2016, and they used a hybrid approach to test this experiment. So we divided our subjects into a few experimental groups. Everyone viewed the same Twitter from the US Navy of the same humanitarian assistance disaster response image from part 2. So they were familiar with it, and they knew that it was an HADR mission. The control group saw no accompanying text, so it was just a tweet of the image. We then had one experimental group that saw a military ability leaning text, so it was still describing the same thing that was happening in the photo, just with a corporate ability lean. We did one for military social responsibility, and then we did 2 cells that were a hybrid that had both a military ability sentence and a military social responsibility sentence. After doing a manipulation check, one of the hybrid cells was not able to self-identify, so we scrapped it, and thankfully we still had the second hybrid experimental cell. So what we found through analyses of variance is that if there is no text accompanying the image, the overall trustworthiness of the military decreased. So if there's any text, there was better trustworthiness versus pre and post, and no text, the trustworthiness significantly decreased. The second was that for any text that had corporate social responsibility language, the overall perception of corporate social responsibility as being values driven by the military significantly increased, which basically means people thought that we were doing it genuinely and not for some additional bonus. So what does this all mean? It means that public affairs officers in the military matter. Anyone can post a photo to Twitter of an HADR mission. But what we do is we contextualize that mission and we tell the audience what is important and why. And that's really powerful because we have UPARs, we have people that are collateral duty PAOs, and yes, they can also post a photo to social media, but we know what it means. And we know how to develop that relationship with that millennial and Gen Z audience that values social consciousness. They value that we have genuine values behind what we're doing. So we would challenge future researchers to look at that continuum between military ability and military social responsibility. As PAOs, we're really good about highlighting military ability, about what we do and kinetically bring to the fight. But this shows that military social responsibility is also important, and we need to focus on that verbiage and that language just as much as we're focusing on military ability language when it comes to these MSR-based missions. So thank you for coming to our presentation. We'll open it up for any questions.
It was a great presentation, very informative. I'm curious to know, did you look across the naval forces, the naval services to determine what current PAOs are using more? Are they using text that talks about military ability, or are they using text that talks about their social responsibility?
So we didn't do quantitative primary research for that, but this term of military social responsibility is something completely new that we've linked the public diplomacy with public relations. So I don't think before we had started this study, we didn't really know what specific language we were looking for, and that was what was so great about this 3-part tiered study, is that we were able to really hone in on what that language is and how it's effective.
So obviously a big trend, TikTok and other platforms is video. Did you account for the potential impact of video and audio telling the story in addition to simply just written text?
Sure, we didn't, because this was an exploratory study. We were looking at these concepts to make sure they were actually valid. And then we wanted to see some initial applications just to kind of figure out, where we stood within those. So those would certainly be areas we want to take it in the future, but it wasn't something we considered for this study.
I think something just important to point out for the Navy too is that it's very difficult to get audio and video off of ships at some points. So we rely very heavily on photographs and written context.
So it's kind of a follow-up to that. We look at the platforms that we're utilizing in the military, and we consider our limitations, and we look at the trends that are happening in the real world, and we have to ask ourselves, how do we leverage those trends to get our information through to the preferred channels to our target audience? So that's what we have to figure out, right? We thanks to your study, we know that it makes an impact. Now we have to figure out how do we leverage the platforms that our audiences are using to get the message.
Well, and that was another part of the value of us doing the study, is there is a significant amount of literature about social responsibility and corporate ability. And so we can take some of those lessons learned from that literature and see if they apply to us and possibly use that. But that was part of what we wanted to accomplish with this.
So, go ahead, Adam. So I'll stay on some of the similar trends here. So you presented visuals, right, that went across the spectrum to kind of, gauge people's understanding of both CSR and then CA as it relates to military ability and military social responsibility. And then you added the text as another variable alongside there. But did you cross-pollinate that imagery and that text to kind of see what resonates more with those folks as far as applicability, as far as the image or the words, right? So did you take CSR text and put it on like a military ability type thing, right? And is it the words that mattered most to them, or was it the visuals that resonated with your audience as far as conveying which way that went?
So we actually chose HADR because from part 2 of our study, it fell in the middle of our CSR-CA scale. So we specifically picked HADR because it was viewed by some people as corporate or as military ability and some people as military social responsibility. So we were able to kind of look at it as that intermediary. We wanted to make sure that we kept it reasonable, part 3 of our study, and really look at one photo and how it could be how the perception could change based on the text. But that is something that we could do moving forward, is to look at some of those other missions, because we used CAREDAG 2017. These were missions that had already been identified and researched as military public diplomacy missions. So they were chosen specifically, and then HADR was in the middle from our part 2.
Message creation always focuses on who's your audience, right? And the pool that you did your experiment on, they're American, they're young, they value social messaging. How do you think it would have changed if, your audience is RIMPAC and you're really trying to speak to a foreign audience? How do you think that would go based on your research?
I think it'd be completely different. I think we'd have to look at what their interests are and what motivates them and what they want to see. From the military, as a foreign military, or from their own military. I think it's really specific to that primary and secondary research we did at the beginning.
Hey, so I think that overall the idea of tying knives, soft power, hard power to corporate social responsibility and corporate ability, really clever. I really like that. I do have a question, but before I say that, you made the comment that getting video off of ships is difficult, but hard is authorized, right? So you can get video off of ships. Hey, Mac, I think you mentioned that corporate ability, the hard power stuff, was easy for people to spot, but for the corporate social responsibility on the military side, military social responsibility, kind of soft power, it was more on a continuum. Does that match how audiences see non-military corporate social responsibility and corporate ability, or is it more distinct outside of the military?
So that was a difficulty with us going in and trying to fit these terms too, because traditionally corporate ability is understood as like profit making, things that are directly tied to that. And so people's conception of that with the military are obviously different. And so the short answer is we don't know what that continuum means. But it was an interesting fact to find out that they do kind of see it as a mix. They do see when we do corporate or when we do military ability or social responsibility missions, they also see it as an ability of ours. So where that understanding goes, I mean, is for future research, but
That doesn't match how they see corporate social responsibility.
no, it doesn't, no, sir.
All right, well, thank you guys very much. That team was, to say that they were ambitious is an understatement. It's part of my job is to create a situation where the students will challenge themselves and learn, but not bite off more than they can chew, right? So I'm trying to create these bumpers for them. And they came to me in I don't even know, it's probably August, with the idea of the study. And like Admiral Brown said, I too was like, how is it no one ever thought of this? It really is clever, really is smart, thoughtful, creating those connections. And then as we got further and further into it, they were like, well, before we do this, we actually got to do this. And before we can do that to justify this, we actually have to step back another step. And so this turned into this 3-part study, which is crazy town. So congratulations to that team for doing such an amazing job, because you not only did it, but you talked me into letting you do it. And that in itself is quite the feat. So our next presentation is what I like to call the booster study, Boost. And this is about the CDC. And I don't know if you've caught on to this, but some of their communication has been a little whiplashy. And so we're going to find out what that has meant for the reaction to the CDC.